It was early October when I decided to get away from the city for a few days. I had been buried under work and noise for months, and the urge to just disconnect had been gnawing at me relentlessly. I found a small cabin listed online, located deep in the woods of northern Vermont, near a place called Green Mountain National Forest. The pictures showed a rustic wooden cabin, isolated, surrounded by thick trees that promised solitude and quiet. No electricity, no cell signal, just the basics and nature. Exactly what I needed. I packed my gear carefully. A sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, a small stove and propane tank, canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a basic hunting knife. I figured I'd spend the days hiking and exploring, and the nights just sitting by the fire, reading or listening to the silence. I was mentally prepared for the isolation. I'd been camping before and knew what to expect, but nothing about this trip prepared me for what happened. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive itself was long and winding, taking me off the main highway onto dirt roads that slowly deteriorated into barely marked trails. The GPS signal faded almost completely once I turned onto the final stretch. I was careful not to rush, watching the trees close in on either side of the narrow track. Eventually, the road opened into a small clearing where the cabin sat, squat and weathered but sturdy. The porch sagged a little under the weight of years of weather, but the structure seemed sound. A woodpile lay stacked neatly by the side, and a thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, signaling someone had been here recently. That was the first odd thing. The listing said the cabin was unoccupied, and I hadn't been told anyone else would be there. But no one greeted me when I stepped onto the porch. I checked the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was sparse but cozy. A small wood stove dominated one corner. A handmade table and 2 chairs sat near a window, and a cot was tucked into another corner. The floor was rough pine planks, and the walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved food and old tools. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. I unpacked quickly, set up the stove, and got a fire going. The sun was dropping low behind the trees, turning the sky a dull orange. I boiled some water, ate a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, and settled in for the night. The first evening was quiet, peaceful even. I sat on the porch watching the stars come out one by one. No city lights, no sounds except the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of an owl. I was glad I came. Around midnight, I woke up. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down completely. I got up to stoke the stove back to life. That's when I noticed it. A faint scratching noise coming from just outside the cabin. Soft at first, almost like the sound of claws scraping against wood or stone. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal, so I ignored it and went back to bed. But the next night, the scratching returned, louder this time and more persistent. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something trying to get in. Over the next 2 days, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. The branches swayed with the wind, shadows seemed to stretch longer, and every little noise made me tense up. I kept my knife close and checked the locks several times each night. On the 3rd evening, the sun was setting in that cold, gray way it does in autumn, when the world seems to lose color and the light gets thin and sharp. I had just finished collecting water from a nearby stream, a few hundred yards from the cabin, when I heard voices. Not loud, just faint murmurs carried on the wind, indistinct but close enough to make my heart race. I didn't stay to listen. I walked fast back to the cabin, constantly glancing behind me. When I reached the door, I locked it and checked the windows. They were thick glass, but the cabin wasn't built to keep out anything too big or too determined. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scratching again. But this time it was joined by other sounds. Footsteps crunching on leaves, low groans, something scraping against the doorframe. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, just out of the beam from my flashlight. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a hunter passing by. The cabin was on a trail, after all. but the fear gnawed at me like a slow poison. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay. The feeling in the woods was thick, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I packed my things in the morning, double-checked my supplies, and planned to leave before dark. As I loaded the last of my gear into my pack, I noticed something odd on the porch. There were marks on the wood, deep gouges, as if someone or something had tried to pry the door open with a crowbar or a big knife. They weren't there when I arrived. I knelt to look closer and saw dark streaks on the wood that looked like dried blood. My stomach twisted. I debated what to do. My car was about 10 miles down the dirt road. If someone was nearby, I was in trouble. But staying wasn't an option either. I locked the door, grabbed my flashlight, and started the walk down the road. The sun was already low, and the shadows of the trees grew long and black. I kept my eyes on the woods but saw nothing at first. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, careful, coming from the dense forest on my left. I stopped and listened. The footsteps stopped too. I moved forward again, faster now. I heard a twig snap behind me. I didn't look back. I ran. The dirt road was uneven, covered with roots and loose stones. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the fading sound of civilization. I wasn't sure if whoever was following me was still there, but I didn't want to find out. I stumbled once but kept going. At last, I saw my car's headlights flicker in the distance. Relief washed over me, but my skin was crawling with adrenaline. I reached the car, unlocked the door, and jumped inside, locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine. That's when I saw it in the rearview mirror. A figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching me. It didn't move, just stared. The headlights caught something in its hand, a long, rusty crowbar. I slammed the door and peeled away, the gravel crunching under my tires as I sped down the road, not daring to look back again. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at a nearby motel with working cell service and reported the incident to the local police. They told me the area had a history of break-ins and that several cabins had been targeted recently by a group of people who were looking for supplies and shelter for the winter. The figure I saw was probably one of them. They searched the area but found no one. The cabin was checked later by forest rangers and found abandoned. The gouges and blood on the door were never explained, but no one else was hurt. I never went back. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead it became a sharp reminder of how close danger can be when you're isolated and alone. The forest hides a lot more than animals and trees. It hides people desperate and dangerous, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones that live in the real world, not in stories. Since then, I've kept a wary eye whenever I'm out in the wild. I still love the outdoors, but I never forget that beneath the beauty, there can be real threats lurking in the shadows. Started as just a plan to get away for a few days. I had been working nonstop for months, drowning in emails, meetings, and the constant buzz of city life. The noise, the crowded streets, the endless light pollution. It all wore me down until I finally decided I needed to disappear for a while. No internet, no calls, no people. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and silence. I found the cabin online through a small rental website. It was located in a remote forest area several hours north of the city. The pictures looked perfect, rustic but cozy, surrounded by trees, with a small lake nearby. No neighbors for miles. Exactly what I needed. The drive was long, about 4 hours, with the last 2 on a gravel road that twisted through dense woodland. The sky was gray, overcast with low clouds. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as described. A simple wooden structure, weathered but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a front porch. There was a fire pit outside, some stacked logs, and a small dock stretching into the lake. No cell phone service. I had warned my friends and family I might be out of touch. I unloaded my bag into the cabin. Inside was sparse but comfortable. A small kitchen with an old stove, a table, a couch, a bed, and shelves filled with mismatched books and board games. There was a wood stove in the corner and a box of firewood stacked next to it. The place smelled of pine and old wood, with a faint mustiness that came with being closed up for a while. That first evening, I built a fire in the stove, boiled some water for tea, and sat by the window watching the dark forest settle under the twilight. The lake was still, its surface smooth like glass. I felt peaceful for the first time in months. Night came quickly. I went to bed early, the cabin lit only by the flickering fire. The silence outside was complete, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig or distant bird calls. I slept deeply. The next day, I woke to a thick fog hanging over the lake and forest. The air was cool and damp. I made breakfast, coffee, toast, and eggs, and planned to hike a little, explore the woods and the trails the owner had mentioned. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a flashlight, and my phone, though I knew I wouldn't get signal. I set off down the narrow path leading into the trees. The forest was dense, with tall pines and birch. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. The fog gave everything a muted, surreal quality. I moved slowly, trying to take it all in, but something made me uneasy. Not a feeling of danger exactly, but a strange sense of being watched. I shook it off as nerves and kept walking. The trail curved up a gentle hill, and I stopped at a clearing overlooking the lake. From here, I could see the cabin far below, nestled among the trees. The silence was overwhelming, but not unpleasant. I sat on a rock for a while, just breathing in the cold air. As I turned to head back, I noticed something odd, fresh footprints in the dirt. They were boot prints about my size, heading toward the cabin. I frowned. Nobody else was supposed to be around here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the owner had told me I'd likely be alone. I followed the prints cautiously, keeping my eyes on the path. They led directly to the cabin and stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. My heart started to beat faster. Whoever had been here had gotten close to my place. I checked the doors and windows. They were all locked, nothing disturbed inside. Still, the idea of someone else nearby unsettled me. I decided to call the owner the next morning to ask if anyone else might be around or if there were hunters or hikers in the area. That night, I kept the fire going longer and locked the doors carefully before going to bed. The silence felt thicker, heavier. I tried to focus on the peacefulness, but every little noise, the wind shifting branches, the creak of the cabin settling, made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to a noise outside, a soft thud, then silence. I froze in bed, listening. Nothing else. The darkness outside the window seemed to press in on the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The next morning, I found more footprints, this time circling around the back of the cabin near the woodshed. The prints were fresh and looked like someone had been moving carefully, trying not to make noise. I started feeling more on edge. I made a list of things I had to check. Secure the cabin better, find a place to stash a knife in my bag, and make sure the windows were properly latched. By midday, I went back into the woods but stayed closer to the cabin, keeping an eye out for any sign of another person. I found some broken branches and more footprints, sometimes several sets overlapping. Whoever it was had been there multiple times. That evening, I decided to leave a note on the porch, a simple warning: "This cabin is rented. Please respect privacy." I didn't want to confront whoever was coming, but I hoped it might discourage them. The following day, I found the note had been moved, ripped in half and left in the dirt. Whoever it was knew I was watching. Fear was settling in, slow and creeping. I kept the cabin locked and didn't go far from it. I slept with my jacket zipped up, ready to put it on if I had to run. Every sound outside felt amplified. I stopped sitting by the window. On the third night, the power went out. Though the cabin had no electricity, I had a small battery-powered lantern and charged my phone before it died. Suddenly, the darkness inside the cabin felt suffocating. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps outside again. Soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but I saw nothing. The light beam cut through the night but caught only the sway of tree branches. I sat in the corner by the door, holding a large kitchen knife I found in the drawer. My hands trembled. The footsteps stopped. Then, very quietly, I heard a faint scrape at the back door. I held my breath, ready to react. The noise stopped. Silence. I waited, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Morning came, and the sun finally pushed away the dark. I checked the back door. It was locked tight, but near the door was a small pile of sticks arranged like a crude barricade, almost like someone had been trying to get in or leave a message. I packed a small bag quickly. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I didn't want to wait for whoever was out there to make their next move. The drive back was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror and the side windows. The forest seemed to watch me retreat. I called the local police once I got signal. They came out the next day, did a sweep of the area, but found no one. No footprints, no signs of campfires or tents. They said maybe it was a hunter or a drifter who moved on after I left. Still, I never went back. The cabin rental was removed from the website shortly after. Months later, I learned from a news report that a man had been arrested near that forest, wanted for burglary and stalking. He had been living off the grid in the woods, watching cabins and campsites. No one knew how long he had been there. I realized then how close I had come to a very real danger. No ghosts, no monsters, just a man, hiding in the trees, waiting. That experience taught me to never underestimate how vulnerable you can be when you're alone in the wilderness. The woods aren't just quiet. Sometimes they're waiting. I had been looking forward to this solo trip for months. The year had been exhausting. Long days at work, constant noise from the city, and no time to think. I wanted to escape to somewhere quiet, somewhere untouched, somewhere I could just breathe without any distractions. That's how I found the cabin. A small wooden cabin rented out on a website for people who wanted to get away from it all. The pictures showed a simple building surrounded by dense forest, far from any town or road. Exactly what I needed. The cabin was 2 hours from the nearest town, reached by a narrow dirt road that got rougher and narrower as I drove deeper into the woods. The final stretch was a bumpy, barely maintained path, thick with overhanging branches and the kind of silence that made you feel the weight of the forest pressing in on you. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked even smaller and older than it had online. It sat crooked on a slight hill, its wooden walls weathered and dark with age, a thin chimney curling smoke into the cold autumn sky. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, sharp and clean. I parked the car and pulled my bag out, glad I had packed light. The cabin had no cell signal, and I left my phone in the car, knowing it wouldn't help much anyway. I wanted to disconnect completely. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table and 2 chairs, a simple bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove in the corner for heat. There were no lights except for a single lamp on the table, powered by a small solar panel outside. The windows had no curtains, letting the dim light from outside spill in. I liked that, no distractions, just the forest watching me through the glass. I spent the first day unpacking, chopping some firewood, and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. The forest was quiet, too quiet sometimes. Birds occasionally chirped, but I barely heard any insects or rustling animals. Felt strange, but I told myself it was just the season, the way the woods get sleepy when the cold starts creeping in. The night came early. I built a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned soup over the stove. I sat at the table, reading a book by the dim lamp. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I felt calm, almost peaceful. Then, as I was about to head to bed, I heard a noise outside. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind moving branches. I told myself not to worry, but I couldn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I woke early. The sky was overcast, and a cold drizzle started to fall. I decided to stay inside, reading and warming by the stove. Around noon, I thought I heard footsteps again. This time closer, like someone was walking around the cabin. I looked out the window, but there was no one there. The forest was empty, just trees dripping with rain. I started to feel uneasy. The idea that someone might be nearby, watching me, crept into my mind. But who would come out here? The cabin was isolated, and the road was barely passable. That evening, I made sure to lock the door and close the windows. I checked the old wooden latch several times. I kept a heavy metal flashlight and a knife close by just in case. The rain had stopped, but the woods felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Around midnight, the footsteps came again. Slow, deliberate, they circled the cabin, crunching leaves and breaking twigs. I lay in bed, heart pounding, clutching the flashlight. The sound stopped abruptly. I waited for a long time, but nothing else happened. The next day, I explored farther from the cabin. I walked along a narrow stream, the ground wet and muddy, the trees standing like silent giants. I noticed something odd, footprints in the soft mud near the water. They weren't animal prints. They were human and fresh. My skin crawled. Whoever had been walking around the cabin was close by. I didn't see anyone, but the prints suggested someone had passed recently, maybe the night before. I debated leaving immediately, but the car was 2 hours away, and the dirt road was slippery after the rain. I wanted to pack first, but something held me there. Fear? Curiosity? I don't know. That night, I stayed awake longer than before. I sat by the window, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The woods looked endless, shadows twisting and shifting with every flicker of light. Then I saw movement. A figure crouched low, moving slowly between the trees maybe 50 yards away. My breath caught. The figure paused and stared in my direction. I couldn't see a face, just a dark shape blending into the forest. Then it disappeared into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I packed up everything quickly and drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, when I was back home in the city, I noticed something strange. There were marks on my front door, deep scratches running vertically, like claws or nails scraping wood. I live on a busy street in an apartment building. No one would have tried to break in without me hearing. I checked my car. The back bumper had fresh scratches, similar to the ones on the door. My phone, which had been off during the trip, suddenly had no signal, and some messages I never sent were stored in drafts. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. No handwriting, no signature, just a single line written in black marker. "You're not as alone as you think." Panic set in. I changed my locks, called the police, but there was no evidence, no footage, no proof anyone had been near my place. I started noticing other signs. Footprints outside my apartment entrance, missing items that reappeared moved, strange sounds outside at night. No one ever tried to contact me directly, no calls or messages, just these silent reminders that someone had been there. I realized that during those nights in the woods, someone had been watching me, learning where I was, and had followed me home. The isolation I thought I wanted had been invaded. I don't know how long this will last. I don't know who it is or what they want. But I do know this: the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by someone real, someone patient, someone dangerous. The forest was never empty. It was waiting, and so was I. I hadn't planned on spending the night in that cabin. Not really. It was just supposed to be a quick stop on my hike, a place to rest before heading back to my car in the morning. But once I was there, the way things unfolded, I had no choice but to stay. And by the time it was over, I knew I'd never forget those hours. Not for any ghost stories or fairy tales, but for something much more real, much darker, and all too human. I'd been hiking alone for 2 days in a dense forest upstate, miles from the nearest town or road. My goal was to clear my head, get away from everything for a bit. The kind of trip where you trust only your own 2 feet and the gear on your back. I had a small backpack with the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, a map, a flashlight, and a basic camping stove. I was experienced enough to know how to handle myself, and I wasn't careless. The woods around there were thick and wild, but I'd mapped out my route carefully. As evening fell, the light grew soft and golden, filtering through the tall pine trees. I knew the sun would set soon. I was tired and my legs ached, but I still had about 3 miles to cover before reaching the small cabin marked on my map. The cabin was supposed to be an old hunting lodge abandoned decades ago, but I had read online that it was still standing, somewhat intact. I planned to rest there, maybe spend the night and pack up early in the morning. I found the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The building was old and weather-beaten, made of rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. The roof sagged a little and the windows were mostly boarded up, but the door was still hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open with some effort. Inside, the cabin was musty and smelled of damp wood and mildew. Dust floated in the fading light. There was an old wood stove in one corner, a few broken chairs, and a rickety table covered with a thick layer of dirt and dead leaves. The floor creaked under my boots. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was shelter, and that was enough. I unpacked my backpack and laid out a thin sleeping mat on the floor near the stove. There was a stack of old firewood piled against one wall, so I gathered some kindling and lit a small fire. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the cabin felt warmer, less lonely. I ate some of the food I'd packed, dried jerky, nuts, and a granola bar, and then filled my water bottle from a small stream nearby. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I settled in, thinking I'd rest and sleep soundly, then leave at first light. But then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint scratching, like something clawing at the wood outside. I assumed it was a raccoon or a squirrel, or maybe a deer brushing against the trees. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the warm glow it gave. But as night deepened, the noises grew louder and closer. Scraping, tapping, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs. Sometimes, I thought I heard heavy breathing just beyond the cabin walls. My heart rate sped up. I grabbed my flashlight and shone the beam around the clearing. Nothing, just the dark, endless forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising, given how far in the woods I was. I felt a stab of isolation. The scratching continued in fits and starts throughout the night. Sometimes right at the door, other times by the windows. I stayed close to the fire, clutching a large stick I'd found nearby for protection. Hours passed slowly. My nerves frayed. I kept listening for any signs of actual danger. Around midnight, I heard a sudden loud noise outside, like something heavy falling over. I froze. The fire flickered as a cold breeze blew in through a crack in the cabin wall. I scanned the darkness but saw nothing. Then came footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, circling the cabin. They moved softly through the underbrush, but there was an unmistakable rhythm, as if whoever or whatever it was stalking me. I didn't run. I knew the forest was thick, and running blindly at night would be dangerous. I stayed still, quiet, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving to the far side of the cabin. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A wild bear? A coyote? Or worse, a person? I thought about shouting, but realized I might just attract attention. Instead, I grabbed my knife and flashlight, ready to defend myself. The footsteps receded slowly, disappearing into the blackness. I waited, eyes wide, heart pounding. Minutes later, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the firelight, something crouching behind a tree. I held my breath. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard the sharp crack of a branch breaking, something large moving fast. I grabbed my backpack, ready to bolt if necessary. The scratching came again, louder now. At the window nearest me, I shone the flashlight directly at the glass. Nothing, but then a heavy thud on the door. I spun, knife raised. The door shook, as if someone was trying to break in. I shoved against it with all my strength. The old wood creaked, but held. I realized I was completely vulnerable. No way to call for help. No way to escape without stepping into total darkness. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. If it was an animal, maybe it would lose interest. If it was a person, I needed a plan. The banging stopped suddenly. Silence. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the fire crackling. Then, footsteps retreating quickly into the woods. I didn't dare move until dawn. The night dragged on. I stayed close to the fire, eyes fixed on the dark tree-line. At first light, I packed up quickly, careful not to make noise. The forest was eerily still, almost like it was holding its breath. I didn't look back. I walked fast, head down, until I reached the trail. Later, at my car, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told me there had been a string of robberies and break-ins in the area, often targeting hikers and campers. Thieves would lurk near abandoned cabins, waiting for people to stop and then trying to steal gear or worse. They warned me to be careful, especially at night. That night in the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or monsters. It was haunted by something far more real and terrifying. People who preyed on others in the wilderness, using fear and silence as weapons. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't imaginary. They're human. And out there, in the dark woods, when you're alone and vulnerable, those realities come crashing down hard. I hadn't planned to stay the night at the cabin. Honestly, I was just passing through. The plan was simple. Drive from the city, get away from the noise and the endless buzz of people for a day or two, hike a bit, and then drive back home before nightfall. But things don't always go the way you imagine. I was driving along a narrow country road that wound through thick pine forests. The trees on either side were tall and close enough to blot out much of the sky. The air was cold and sharp for early autumn, the kind of chill that makes you tighten your jacket around your neck. I'd spotted the cabin on a map earlier, a small old structure marked Pine Ridge Cabin, about halfway up a ridge overlooking a valley. It wasn't a tourist spot or a rental cabin. It was marked as a ranger station or maybe just a maintenance cabin. The map didn't say much, just the location, and a note that there was a trailhead nearby. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The road was a single lane in many spots, patched with cracks and loose gravel. The tires on my old Subaru crunched as I drove slower, eyes searching for the cabin. After about 20 minutes, I saw it. A wooden structure, low and squat, with a slanted roof covered in dark shingles. It looked abandoned or maybe rarely used. Moss crept over the windowsills, and the wood was weathered a deep gray. I pulled over and cut the engine. The forest was quiet except for the distant call of a crow and the soft rustle of wind in the trees. I stepped out, the cold biting at my cheeks immediately. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. I wanted to check out the cabin, stretch my legs, and maybe find a spot for a quick rest. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and stale, but not musty. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight through the grimy windows. The cabin was small, about the size of a one-room shack. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a wooden table with a few empty cans and a rusted thermos, and a small fireplace with some ashes inside. I found a rusty old oil lamp on a shelf, cleaned it off with my sleeve, and checked to see if it worked. The glass was cracked, but the wick was intact. I stuffed a small notebook and a pen into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone to check the signal. None. No bars at all. That was expected. I decided I'd stay a little while longer, maybe hike up the trail behind the cabin, then head back down before dark. But as I closed the door behind me, I noticed something odd. Faint scratches on the wooden door frame. They were deep, like someone had been trying to claw or scrape their way in. The marks looked old but fresh at the same time, as if someone had tried recently. I shook off the feeling. Maybe an animal or some woodpecker damage, I thought. The trail was narrow and steep, leading up through dense pines and underbrush. It was easy to get lost here if you weren't paying attention. I followed it for about an hour, the sun dropping lower in the sky behind the hills. When I turned to head back, the light was fading fast. The trees cast long shadows, and the forest grew colder, quieter. I felt uneasy, like I wasn't alone, but there was no one in sight. Back at the cabin, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, pulling my jacket tighter. I set the oil lamp on the table and lit it. The soft flicker of the flame threw uneven shadows against the walls, making the small space feel both cozy and claustrophobic. I sat on the cot and pulled out a small emergency snack from my backpack, a granola bar and a bottle of water. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the old wood. Then I heard it, a faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was just branches hitting the windows, but the tapping was rhythmic and deliberate.
Top.
Tap, tap, like nails on wood. I froze. The sound wasn't outside. It was coming from the back wall, near the fireplace. I picked up the oil lamp and walked carefully toward the noise. My heart was pounding. The tapping stopped. I inspected the wall. The wooden planks were old and rough. Suddenly, I noticed one board was loose, slightly bowed out at the bottom. I pulled on it. It gave way. Behind the board was a small hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a dirty, moldy cloth, was a small bundle of papers and a rusted metal box. I pulled the box out carefully. It was locked, but light enough to lift. The papers were yellowed and brittle, covered in messy handwriting. I spread them out on the table under the lamp. They were diary entries from someone named Tom. The entries were dated from about 20 years ago. The writing was frantic, filled with warnings about someone, or something, that had been following him in the woods near the cabin. He wrote about strange sounds at night, footprints near his camp, and a feeling of being watched. But most chilling was the last entry. It described how he had locked himself inside the cabin after hearing footsteps outside and banging on the door. He said he was scared to leave because whoever was outside wanted to hurt him. The last line was scratched out, almost illegible. My hands trembled as I put the diary down. I wasn't sure what I expected. A ghost story? A nightmare? But no supernatural thing would explain the next hours. I sat back and listened. The tapping returned, but louder this time, coming from outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind or branches. It was deliberate and slow, like someone was using their fingers or a stick to tap on the cabin walls. Then I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Heavy, slow footsteps. I had no phone signal and no way to call for help. The forest was dark now, and the road was too far to walk safely at night. I was trapped. I thought about running, but the door was right there, and whoever was outside might be waiting. The footsteps stopped near the window. I held the oil lamp up, trying to see anything through the dirt-smudged glass. I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, clutching the lamp, staring at the door. At dawn, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The ground was soft with damp leaves. I saw fresh footprints, large boots around the cabin. They circled the whole structure, sometimes stopping, then moving on. I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my backpack and started walking down the trail. Halfway down the path, I noticed something half buried in the dirt, a battered leather wallet. Inside was a driver's license photo of a man in his 40s. The name was the same as the diary, Tom. Next to the wallet was a crumpled, blood-stained shirt. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just a story. This was real. I pushed faster, the trail growing steeper and rougher. At the bottom, I reached the road and saw a car parked a few hundred feet away. No one was inside. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin stood silent in the morning light, just an old wooden shack. But I knew whatever had scared Tom, whatever had been out there in the dark with me, was still somewhere nearby. I never went back. The next days, back in town, I reported what I found to the local sheriff. They said Tom had been reported missing years ago, but no body was ever found. The area was known for occasional hikers disappearing, but the police had no leads. I showed them the diary and the wallet. They took them, promised to investigate. Still, the fear lingered. The police said they'd search the forest, but I knew the woods were vast and dense. Whoever or whatever was out there could hide easily. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps outside the cabin, the tapping on the walls, the feeling of being watched. reflection. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that scared me. It was real people, real threats. Someone had been in those woods, watching, waiting. Maybe Tom had gotten in over his head, or stumbled on something he shouldn't have. Maybe whoever was out there didn't want anyone else to find the cabin or the diary. The isolation, the dark, the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was dangerous. I'll never forget that night. The cold, the tapping, the footsteps circling my little shelter. And I'll never go back to Pine Ridge. The sky was the kind of gray that felt heavy and close, like the air itself was waiting to fall apart. I had been driving for hours on a narrow, winding road flanked by thick trees that pressed close to the edges like they wanted to push the road away. My destination was a small cabin tucked away in the deep woods, someplace I'd rented on a whim to get away from the city, the noise, and the constant buzz of life that never seemed to slow down. I reached the turnoff late in the afternoon. A rusty, faded sign marked the path to the cabin, almost hidden behind overgrown branches and a scattering of dead leaves that the wind flicked across the dirt road. The narrow track looked like it hadn't been used much lately, but the GPS said I was close. I switched off the engine and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the quiet. The forest around me was still, almost unnervingly so. No birdsong, no rustling animals, just a thick, humid silence that pressed in on me. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that blocked much of the light. It was an old place, made of rough, weathered logs with a stone chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The windows were dirty, clouded by grime and dust, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. The porch sagged under the weight of years, the wood cracked and uneven. It wasn't the cozy getaway I'd imagined, but I told myself it was just rustic. I'd be fine here. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly musty, like the house had been left empty through a long, cold winter. The floor creaked under my weight, and the walls were bare except for a few old nails and a faded calendar pinned up near the stove. The furniture was sparse, just a rickety table, 2 chairs, and a small bed with a thin mattress covered in a rough blanket. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a hand pump well outside. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake the odd feeling settling in my stomach. I lit a fire in the stove, watching the flames catch and glow, the warmth pushing back some of the chill in the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the trees. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sound, feeling the weight of the silence pressing around me. Night fell fast, the forest outside turning into a deep, black shadow. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the stars were swallowed by the darkness. I lay on the bed, the rough blanket pulled tight, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the fire. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped, then another, not close but not far either. The sound was sharp and sudden, breaking the silence like a crack. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush, but the noise kept coming, small but steady. Twigs breaking, leaves rustling, something moving in the dark. I tried to focus on the fire to keep the fear from growing, but the sound started to shift. Footsteps, maybe 2 sets, pacing slowly just beyond the clearing. I got up and went to the window, the cold glass fogging under my breath. I strained to see through the thick trees, but the darkness swallowed everything. Nothing moved. No headlights, no flashlights, no sign of any person. The cabin felt smaller then, the walls closing in. The idea that someone might be out there, watching or waiting, crept into my mind, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went back to the bed and pulled the blanket tighter, trying to calm down, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I heard the door creak open slowly. My heart jumped into my throat. I stayed frozen, listening. The door didn't slam or bang, just opened wide enough to catch the weak light of the stove fire. Then it shut just as quietly. No footsteps followed. No sounds inside. Nothing but the steady crackle of the fire and the wind outside. I didn't move for a long time. I debated getting up to check, but something held me back. The thought of stepping into the dark, alone, with no way to call for help made my stomach twist. I sat up, gripping the edge of the bed, my eyes on the door. By dawn, the noises stopped. The footsteps vanished. The forest outside seemed almost peaceful again. I told myself it must have been a wild animal pushing the door, or the wind doing its tricks. Still, when I looked around, I noticed the door latch had been moved. Not open all the way, but definitely nudged. The rest of the day, I stayed inside, keeping the fire burning and the door locked tight. I checked the windows carefully, moving heavy furniture against them to block any possible entry. The isolation felt heavier, as if the cabin itself was closing in around me. The next night was worse. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard knocking, soft at first, almost like a tap, then harder, more deliberate. It wasn't the kind of knocking you expect when someone is visiting. It was slow and steady, like someone was testing the wood, listening for a response. I stayed silent, waiting. The knocking stopped. Then came the sound of footsteps again, slow and pacing just outside the cabin. Then something scratched, like claws or nails, along the side of the building, moving around to the back. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I stayed where I was, trying to breathe through the fear. Then I heard it. Something heavy being dragged through the leaves, just beyond the trees. It wasn't animal sounds. It was too deliberate, slow, and methodical. I realized then I wasn't just being watched. Someone was out there. Someone who wanted to get inside. I had a small axe I kept by the stove for chopping wood. I grabbed it, holding it tight with both hands. The knocking started again, louder, faster. I moved quietly toward the door, trying to find a way to secure it better. The cabin's lock was old and barely worked. I shoved the table against the door, wedging the chair under the handle, trying to make it as difficult as possible to open. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. Then silence, a breathless pause that made every second stretch endlessly. I stood frozen, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I knew if I left the cabin I'd be exposed, vulnerable. Suddenly, a heavy thud hit the door, then another. The door shook violently, the wood groaning under the force. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, splinters flying. The door swung open a few inches, but the table blocked it from opening fully. I raised the axe, preparing to swing at whatever was pushing it. But then the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated into the darkness. I stayed awake until sunrise, never letting the fire die down, the axe close at hand. In the daylight, I inspected the damage. The door frame was broken. The wood cracked and splintered. Someone had tried hard to break in, maybe to steal, maybe for worse. I didn't want to think about what. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed what little I had and prepared to leave. I wasn't sure what I was more afraid of, what might have been out there, or the fact that no one would come looking for me if I disappeared. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The road seemed longer and lonelier than before. The forest didn't feel like a refuge anymore, but a place where something could hide just out of sight, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a strange relief. The noise of cars and people felt loud and overwhelming, but safe. I called the rental company and told them I wouldn't be staying the full time. They mentioned that the cabin had been closed for months because of a string of break-ins, but no one wanted to fix the door or stay there. They sent someone to board it up after I left. I never went back. Sometimes, when I'm out hiking or camping in the wilderness, I think about that night and wonder what exactly was out there in the dark, how close it came to getting inside. The forest is beautiful and peaceful most of the time, but I learned that even in the quietest places, danger can be real and very close, waiting just beyond the trees, silent and patient. It was a harsh lesson in how alone you can be, even when surrounded by nature, and how fast a place that's supposed to be safe can turn into something terrifying without any warning. I had always liked the idea of getting away from everything for a while. The noise, the crowds, the endless buzzing of phones and screens. I figured a cabin in the woods was perfect for that. Not too far from town, but far enough to feel like I was truly alone. When I found a small cabin for rent, off a little dirt road in the mountains, I thought it was ideal. Just me, the trees, and some quiet time to clear my head. The drive-in was uneventful at first. The sky was clear, the sun low but bright, filtering through the leaves. The dirt road wound through thick forest, the smell of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. I passed no one, which felt good. The trees grew taller, closer together, branches arching overhead. My car made soft crunching sounds on the gravel as I moved deeper in. I had my phone fully charged, a flashlight, some food and water, and a thick jacket. I felt prepared. When I pulled up to the cabin, I stopped and stared for a moment. It wasn't much, just a simple wooden structure, maybe 30 feet wide and 20 deep, with a small porch. The wood was old and weathered, stained dark from years of rain and sun. The windows were small and dusty, with faded curtains inside. A thin trail of smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney. No other houses or cabins were visible, just trees thick and endless. I got out and looked around. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles. A faint smell of wood smoke lingered. There were a few logs stacked near the porch and a rusty metal bucket near the steps. The air was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. Felt good, peaceful. I liked the stillness. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had left in a small tin box nailed near the doorframe. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, the cabin was small and musty. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a fold-out cot against one wall. There was a tiny bathroom in the corner with a cold water sink and a small toilet. The place was clearly old, and it smelled like damp wood and mildew mixed with the faint scent of smoke. Nothing fancy, but it was clean enough. The windows let in some fading light, but the room was already dim. I set my things down and started a fire in the wood stove. The logs were dry, and soon a warm glow filled the room. The heat spread quickly, pushing back the chill from outside. I boiled some water and made a cup of instant coffee, sipping it slowly as I looked out the window at the forest. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower. The trees moved gently in the wind, their branches swaying and scratching softly against each other. Night fell quickly. The sky turned dark blue, then black. The stars came out, shining bright and cold above the treetops. The moon was thin and pale, barely lighting the ground. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, throwing flickering light onto the walls. The cabin felt small but safe, a little island of warmth in the vast cold dark outside. I settled in for the night, feeling calm and a little tired. I had no reason to feel uneasy. The forest was quiet except for natural sounds. Wind, leaves, an occasional bird or insect. I laid back on the cot and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. After some time, I started hearing something else. Not the usual sounds of the forest, but something different. A faint noise, almost like a soft crunching or scraping sound outside, near the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some small animal moving through the leaves, but it didn't stop. It was slow, steady, and deliberate. I opened my eyes and sat up. The cabin was dark except for the firelight. I listened closely. The sound was definitely outside, crunching on dry leaves, breaking small twigs, slow and careful steps. It didn't sound like deer or raccoons or normal forest animals. Those move fast, darting, or they make rustling noises, not slow, steady footsteps. I stood and moved quietly to the window. Peering out into the dark, I could just make out shapes in the shadows. The trees loomed tall and black, their trunks like pillars. The firelight flickered behind me, and my breath came out in small clouds in the cold air. I watched, waiting, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time moving away from the cabin slowly, crunching through leaves and twigs. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing heart. It was probably a deer or some other animal. I told myself, maybe a raccoon, a fox, or a bear. I'd heard bears moved slowly sometimes. Still, the slow, careful steps didn't feel right. They felt deliberate. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire burning low, ears straining for any sound. The footsteps never came close again, but I heard them far off, fading into the woods. I didn't see any lights, no signs of other people or vehicles, just the vast, dark forest. Morning came slow and gray. The sky was cloudy and heavy. I stepped outside and looked around. The ground near the cabin was undisturbed except for my footprints. No other tracks. The forest was quiet again. I ate a quick breakfast, packed a little, and decided to explore a bit. I took my flashlight and some water, then followed a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The path was overgrown and narrow, with thick bushes on both sides. The trees towered overhead, blocking most of the light. The forest floor was soft and covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. I walked carefully, enjoying the quiet. No animals, no birds, just the sound of my footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I went maybe a quarter mile, then stopped at a small clearing. The ground was uneven and rocky here, with a small stream running through it. The water was clear and cold. I knelt and cupped some in my hands, drinking slowly. As I looked up, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by bushes, were footprints. Human footprints. They were large, muddy, and looked fresh, maybe from the night before. I stared at them, a cold feeling growing in my stomach. The prints led off into the forest, away from the cabin. They were heavy, uneven, and some looked like they dragged slightly. Something about them made my skin crawl. I took a few photos with my phone, then hurried back to the cabin. Inside, I locked the door and checked the windows. All were closed and secure. I sat down, trying to think through what I had seen. Who else was out here? The area was supposed to be private, with no other cabins or homes for miles. The dirt road I had driven on was rarely traveled. I hadn't passed any cars on the way in, and the nearest town was over an hour away. The footprints didn't look like they belonged to hikers or hunters. They were too large, too heavy, and the dragging looked strange. The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept the fire going, kept the doors locked, and stayed alert. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I saw other signs. Broken branches, disturbed bushes, and more footprints around the perimeter of the cabin. That night, I barely slept. The same slow footsteps came again, circling the cabin just out of sight. They were so deliberate, so quiet, like someone was testing the ground, watching, waiting. The fire burned low, and the cabin felt smaller, colder. I thought about leaving, but it was dark and the dirt road might be slick or dangerous in the early morning. I told myself to stay calm. Around midnight, the power flickered in the nearby town, and the faint glow from the moon disappeared behind thick clouds. The woods grew darker than before. I sat with my back to the wall, flashlight in hand, ears straining for the sound of footsteps or voices. Suddenly, outside the window, something hit the glass. Not hard, but enough to make me jump. I didn't dare look. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and aimed the light out the window. There was nothing there. No animal, no person. Just the thick, dark forest and the faint rustle of leaves. My heart pounded. Whatever had hit the window was gone now. I turned on the porch light, but it didn't reach far into the woods. The darkness beyond seemed endless and empty. I stayed awake the rest of the night, tense and alert, waiting for dawn. When the first pale light came through the windows, I didn't wait. I packed up quickly, grabbed my gear, and headed to the car. The dirt road was muddy and slippery from recent rain. I drove slow, watching the sides of the road carefully. About halfway back, I saw tire tracks in the mud, deep and fresh. They were too wide for a normal car, maybe a truck or SUV. They ran parallel to the road, but then turned off into the woods. I slowed and stopped, looking into the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, but it vanished quickly. I didn't stop again until I reached the highway. When I got home, I reported the footprints and tire tracks to the local ranger station. They told me the area was mostly quiet, but had had occasional reports of trespassers and illegal campers. No arrests or real investigations, since there was no The sky had been a dull, even gray all day when I arrived at the cabin. I pulled my old truck off the dirt road and onto the narrow path that led up a small incline, surrounded by dense trees on both sides. The place was a little overrun, with leaves and pine needles littering the ground and a layer of moss creeping over the porch steps. The cabin was small, roughly 20 feet by 25 feet, but sturdy, made of thick logs with a metal roof that looked like it had weathered many storms. I'd rented it for the week, needing a break from the city and the endless noise and crowds. I told myself I just wanted some peace and quiet, some time to clear my head and maybe write a bit. What I didn't realize was how close to real isolation I was about to get. The late afternoon air was chilly, the kind that sticks in your bones. I had a backpack with my essentials. Some canned food, a small camping stove, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. The cabin had no running water or electricity, which was part of the charm for me at the time.
No distractions.
I was alone and I liked it. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted sink and a cast iron stove, though the chimney looked clogged with soot. A table stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by two creaky chairs. A faded rug lay beneath it, worn thin in places. The only window faced the woods, letting in a faint light, but the glass was grimy and scratched. I set my pack down and started unpacking. After a quick meal of canned beans heated on the stove, I went outside to collect firewood. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I gathered dry branches and pine logs, stacking them neatly near the stone fire pit outside the cabin. The sun was setting fast, and soon the sky turned a deep shade of blue. That night, I built a fire and sat close to it, watching the flames flicker. The crackling of the wood was soothing, and the cold air pressed in on me from all sides. As the fire burned lower, the woods grew darker, almost pitch black, except for the narrow ring of light around the fire. I stayed alert, though, knowing that at night the forest felt different, like something was always watching, just beyond the edge of the light. I went inside the cabin and lit a lantern. The light cast long shadows on the walls, making the small space feel bigger and smaller all at once. I went to the window and looked out, but I saw nothing except the thick blackness of the trees. There was no wind, no movement, just the sound of my own breathing and the creaking of the cabin settling. I tried to write, but my hands trembled a little, and the words didn't come easily. The next day, I planned to explore the nearby trail. I had a map that showed a path leading down to a small lake about 2 miles away. The weather was cold but clear, with a sharpness in the air that made me breathe deeper. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my phone, though I didn't expect to get any signal out here. The trail started off well enough, soft dirt underfoot, leaves crunching with every step. The trees were thick, mostly pines with some scattered oaks. Every now and then, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the distant call of a bird. After about an hour, the trail became steeper and rockier. I had to watch my footing carefully, gripping onto roots and stones to steady myself. Around midday, I reached the lake. It was small and still, a perfect mirror reflecting the gray sky and surrounding trees. I sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, pulled out my phone, and tried again to get a signal. Nothing. I ate a sandwich and rested for a while, listening to the soft lapping of the water against the shore. On the way back, the trail felt different. The light was shifting, and shadows stretched longer. I started to hear noises, distant but clear, a faint rustling that didn't match the wind. I paused several times, scanning the woods, but there was no one there, just the quiet forest. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed the firewood I'd stacked the day before was disturbed. Some logs were shifted, others knocked to the ground. I frowned and looked around, but saw no footprints or other signs. The dirt was dry, and the leaves were thick, so any prints should have shown. I stacked the wood back up and tried to shrug it off as an animal passing through. That night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though I knew it was just me out here. When I lay down to sleep, every small noise felt amplified. The creak of the cabin, the snapping of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. I kept the lantern close and my phone under my pillow, though the battery was already low. On the third day, I decided to explore deeper into the forest. I had found a dirt road on the map that led further north. It was marked as Old Logging Road, and I thought maybe I could find something interesting or at least get a better sense of the area. I left the cabin early, carrying my pack and a small hatchet I found inside. The road was rough and uneven, covered in rocks and roots. Trees on either side grew thick and tall, blocking most of the sunlight. I walked for miles, hearing only the sound of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. Occasionally, I would see broken branches or disturbed underbrush, signs that something had moved through recently. After several hours, I came upon an old rusted truck. It was half buried in the dirt and covered in vines and moss. The windows were shattered, and the tires were flat. Nearby were scattered pieces of old equipment, chains, ropes, and metal scraps. It looked like someone had abandoned it a long time ago. I took a few pictures with my phone, curious about the story behind it. As I stood there, I heard a faint noise coming from the woods behind me. It was low and guttural, almost like a growl. My heart rate quickened, and I spun around, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on me. I didn't like how alone I felt all of a sudden. I made my way back to the cabin faster than before, eyes darting everywhere. When I got inside, I bolted the door and slid a heavy chair under the doorknob, just to feel safer. I sat in the corner with the lantern and waited for night to come. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang against the cabin wall. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat still, listening. Then another bang, and another. Something was hitting the outside wall, hard and heavy. It sounded like someone or something was trying to break in. I grabbed the hatchet and crept toward the door. The lantern's light flickered, casting shaky shadows. The banging stopped suddenly. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. After what felt like an eternity, I edged over to the window and peered out. There, just beyond the edge of the porch, stood a large figure. A man, I realized, dressed in dark clothes and a hood that covered most of his face. He didn't move, just stared at the cabin. My blood ran cold. I ducked away from the window and looked around frantically for an escape. The back door was locked, but I hadn't blocked it. I grabbed my pack and my phone, knowing I had no signal, but hoping maybe it could help somehow. The man stayed outside all night. I stayed inside, barely daring to breathe. When dawn finally came, the man disappeared into the woods. I waited a long time before leaving. The next morning, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast or the firewood. I locked everything and walked back down the dirt road toward my truck. My hands trembled as I started the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The trees swallowed the cabin whole. I knew I would never come back to that place. It wasn't the ghosts or the fairy tales that made it scary. It was the very real feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting, and that if I had stayed one more night, things might have turned far worse. That week in the cabin taught me that nature can be peaceful and beautiful, but it can also hide dangers we can't see until they're right on top of us. I still can't explain who that man was or why he was there. The police said they'd patrol the area, but no one ever caught him. It's a memory I carry with me every time I'm alone in the woods, a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing is just another person lurking in the shadows. Started as an ordinary trip, just me, my car, and a week off work. I had been grinding for months, so I decided to escape the city noise and stress and spend some time alone in nature. I wanted a cabin, somewhere remote enough to be quiet, but not so far I couldn't get out if I needed to. I booked a small cabin through an online rental site in a dense forested area a few hours north of the city. The photos showed a rustic wooden cabin nestled in thick pine trees, with a small porch and a wood stove inside. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long but peaceful. The highway thinned out to country roads, and the landscape gradually changed from urban clutter to open fields, then dense forest. I reached a dirt road marked on the GPS and turned down it. The road was rough and narrow, with trees almost brushing the sides of the car. Every so often, I passed abandoned farm buildings or piles of old logs. It felt like I was leaving civilization behind piece by piece. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing. There was a parking area with room for a few cars. The cabin sat at the far end, barely visible through the thick trees. It looked just like the pictures. The wood was weathered and darkened from years of rain, but still solid. A thin trail wound from the parking spot to the front door. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of dust and pine. The cabin was simple. One big room with a small kitchen corner, a wood stove near the center, and a narrow stairway leading to a loft bedroom. The windows were dirty but intact, and curtains were pulled to the sides. The furniture was basic: a table, a couple of chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a small bed upstairs. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and settled in. The quiet was amazing. No traffic, no people, just the occasional creak of the wood settling and the sound of wind through the trees. At night, the stars were bright and countless, something I never got to see in the city. I was already feeling my mind relax. The first few days passed uneventfully. I explored nearby trails, read books, and cooked simple meals over the stove. The forest was alive with birds and squirrels. I saw deer tracks near the cabin and spotted a few rabbits darting through the underbrush. I brought a camera and took pictures of mushrooms, moss, and old tree trunks. The air smelled fresh, and the nights were chilly but peaceful. Then, on the fourth day, things started to feel off. It began with small noises outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was animals, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the sounds were strange. Late at night, I would hear heavy footsteps crunching on the frozen leaves outside the window, slow and deliberate. Sometimes there was a low thud, like something heavy being dropped or kicked. It wasn't the usual scampering of small animals. The sounds felt closer, almost like someone was pacing just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was just the forest, nothing to worry about. But the sounds persisted. One night, I woke up to a loud banging on the cabin door. I froze. My heart raced. I lay still, listening. The banging came again, slow and forceful. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, but when I shone the light outside, no one was there. The door was locked, the old metal latch secure. I waited a long time, but nothing else happened. After that night, I stayed awake more, listening for noises. The footsteps, banging, and occasional scraping continued, sometimes on the porch, sometimes around the back of the cabin. The wind was calm, so it wasn't branches rubbing. The sounds had a rhythm, almost like someone was circling the cabin, watching. I felt my mood shift. The peace I came for was gone. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to stay. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer or a bear maybe. But bears don't bang on doors or pace with heavy footsteps all night. During the day, I tried to focus on tasks: chopping wood, filling water containers from a nearby stream, hiking further into the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Whenever I stopped moving, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow or a dark shape among the trees. Every time I looked directly, it was gone. On the sixth day, things escalated. I was outside gathering firewood when I noticed something strange on the porch: a set of footprints in the mud. They were large, wider than mine, and only one set. The prints led up to the door but stopped abruptly at the threshold. I walked around the cabin to see if there were more prints, but nothing. It was as if whoever made them had stood there and vanished. My skin crawled. I looked over my shoulder, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. I brought the firewood inside quickly and double-checked all the locks. I even moved the heavy furniture in front of the door for extra security. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire burning high in the stove, the light spilling through the windows. I kept my phone by my side, the flashlight ready. I didn't hear the usual footsteps, but I did hear faint whispers carried by the wind. They weren't words I could make out, more like murmurs or distant talking, the kind that makes your hair stand on end. On the seventh day, the situation became outright dangerous. Early in the morning, before dawn, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. My heart jumped. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the front door. The window next to it was shattered, the glass shards scattered on the porch floor. The frame was bent like something had been forced inside or out. I stepped outside cautiously, shining the beam around. No one was there. No footprints in the mud except my own from last night. It felt impossible someone could have been here and vanished without a trace. My mind raced. I considered leaving immediately, but the road was miles away, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I decided to gather my things quickly and hike out through the woods before anyone else came. As I packed, I found something else. A crudely carved symbol scratched into the wooden siding near the door. It looked like a circle with lines branching out, maybe a marking or a warning. I'd never seen anything like it. I wiped it off, but it kept coming back the next day, deeper etched as if someone was returning. I debated calling the police or ranger station, but the cabin was in a remote area with poor cell reception. My phone barely showed one bar, and I wasn't confident they'd respond quickly. That afternoon, while hiking a trail to clear my mind, I heard something behind me. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on dry leaves quickened my pace. The footsteps matched my speed, never getting closer but never fading. Panic hit me like a wave. I broke into a run, the footsteps chasing me through the trees. My breath burned in my lungs. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door and locked it behind me. I sat trembling by the stove, running scenarios in my head. Whoever was out there was watching, following me, maybe even waiting for me to slip up. That night, I decided to make a plan. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I couldn't hike out in the dark or alone. So I gathered all the supplies I could: food, water, a first aid kit, a sturdy knife, matches, and my phone charger. I made sure the firewood was ready to keep the stove burning. Then I waited for dawn. The next morning, the forest was quiet. No footsteps, no banging.
No scratching marks.
But I knew it was temporary. I packed everything carefully and set out down the dirt road toward the highway. The trail was rough and overgrown in spots. I kept my eyes peeled, constantly scanning the trees. About halfway down, I noticed fresh footprints again, large and deep. They ran parallel to the road but stayed just inside the tree-line, as if someone was keeping pace with me but hidden by the trees. Fear sharpened my senses. I slowed down and stopped behind a tree to listen. The only sounds were birds and the wind. I pushed forward but stayed close to the center of the road. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the bushes ahead. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and wore a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say a word, just stared at me. My heart stopped. I kept my distance and slowly backed away. The man didn't follow but stayed where he was, unmoving. I ran the last stretch to the highway, relief flooding over me when I reached the first car. I called the police as soon as I had signal, reporting everything. They came the next day with a team. They searched the cabin and surrounding woods thoroughly. They found evidence of someone camping nearby: a small fire pit, discarded cans, and a worn sleeping bag. The scratched symbol on the cabin was still there, freshly carved again. They told me there had been reports of a man living illegally in the woods, someone who'd been harassing visitors. No one knew who he was or why he was doing it. The police suspected he was mentally unstable and territorial about the area. The cabin owner agreed to remove the listing from rental sites. The police increased patrols on that road. I didn't go back. In the weeks afterward, I realized how lucky I was. It wasn't ghosts or legends. The sun was sinking low behind the dense line of pines when I finally pulled off the narrow gravel road and into the small clearing where the cabin stood. The place was tucked away deep in the woods, so far off the grid that even the phone barely caught a signal. I'd found the cabin listed on a rental site, one of those rare spots where you could truly escape the noise of city life. The photos had shown a rustic wooden structure, weathered but solid, surrounded by towering trees and a small creek running nearby. I'd been itching for some solitude, some time alone to think and decompress, so I'd booked a week there. The air smelled thick with pine and earth, damp from the recent rain. It was already cooling down fast. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed the soft crunch of dead leaves and pine needles beneath my boots, and the faint sound of the creek flowing close by. The cabin was even more isolated than I'd expected. No other houses or cabins visible in any direction, just the forest stretching out as far as the eye could see. The cabin itself was simple. A single story, maybe 600 square feet, built from rough timber logs with a metal roof that had patches of rust. The windows were dusty but intact. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the musty smell inside hit me immediately. It was a mix of old wood, dampness, and something else, like stale air that hadn't been refreshed in weeks, maybe months. The interior was sparse. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table and chairs, a tiny couch, and a loft bedroom above. There was no electricity except for a few battery-powered lamps left behind. No internet, no phone signal, no TV, just quiet. I set down my bags and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. I unpacked slowly, placing my food in the small cooler, lighting the kerosene lantern, and starting a fire in the old stone fireplace. The wood was dry enough, and soon the flames were crackling, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest was darkening quickly, the trees casting long, black shapes across the clearing. I sat on the couch, listening to the fire pop and the distant rush of the creek. The isolation was peaceful, but there was something else in the air. A stillness so deep it almost felt like silence had weight. The kind of silence that presses down on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every tiny noise. My own breathing sounded loud. After dinner, I settled into the loft to sleep. The bed was a simple mattress on a wooden frame, covered with a worn quilt. The cabin creaked quietly as the wind stirred the trees outside. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Noises I tried to ignore. The first night passed with restless sleep. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, crunching on the gravel. I sat up, heart pounding, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but shadows and trees. I told myself it was an animal or the wind. I tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to explore. The creek was clear and cold, the water rushing over smooth stones. The forest was thick, mostly pine with some birch and maple scattered through. The ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles, soft underfoot. There were no trails, no paths, just wild woods stretching endlessly. I walked carefully, noticing the signs of animals. A broken branch here, deer tracks in the mud there. I felt both small and exposed in this vast place. As the day went on, I settled into a routine. I chopped firewood, cleaned the cabin, and explored the surroundings carefully. The quiet was profound. No cars, no planes, no people. Just me and the forest. On the third day, something shifted. It was late afternoon when I noticed it. I'd been outside chopping wood near the creek, and when I looked up toward the cabin, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line, a shadow slipping between the trunks. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was a deer or a fox, but the movement seemed too deliberate, too smooth. I felt eyes on me. I told myself I was imagining things. I was alone out here, no one else for miles. Why would anyone be watching? Still, that night, as I sat by the fire, I heard something strange, soft thumps outside, like footsteps pacing around the cabin. I froze, heart racing, and listened hard. The sounds stopped abruptly. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, peeking out into the dark. The beam sliced through the black, revealing nothing but trees and empty clearing. I checked the locks and windows carefully, then sat back down, trying to calm my nerves. The forest can play tricks on your mind when you're alone too long. But the next day, the unease only grew. In the morning, I went to gather water from the creek and found something odd. On the muddy bank near the cabin, there were footprints, large, heavy boots pressed deep into the soil. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. I compared them to my own shoes. They were much bigger. Someone had been near the cabin. Panic tightened my chest. I looked around, the trees seeming suddenly hostile and alive. I scanned the woods, but no one was there. I debated leaving right then, but the nearest road was miles away, and my car was parked back at the clearing. If someone was watching, I didn't know if I could get away quickly. I went back inside and locked every door and window, even bolting the front door with a thick wooden bar I found near the firewood pile. I set the lantern low, the flames flickering in the small room. I tried to stay calm, breathing slowly. That afternoon, as I tried to distract myself by cleaning, I heard it again. Scraping sounds outside, faint but persistent, like someone dragging something heavy across the gravel near the cabin. I stood frozen, the noise moving around the building slowly. I grabbed my small hunting knife from my backpack and kept it in my hand. I spent the night in the loft wide awake, listening to every sound. The wind in the trees, the creak bubbling, the scratching and scraping beyond the walls. In the morning, I found something that shook me deeply. Near the back door, someone had left a pile of stones, arranged in a rough circle. Inside it lay an old, rusty can of food. Not my food, not anything I'd brought. The message was clear. Someone had been close enough to leave a sign. I called the local sheriff's office from my car using a spotty cell signal. I explained my situation and asked if there had been any reports of suspicious activity in the area. They said no, but promised to send someone to check the cabin. I felt a small measure of relief, but I didn't want to wait. I packed my bags as fast as I could and left the cabin that day. On the drive back down the gravel road, I kept glancing nervously into the woods, feeling eyes on me. A week later, the sheriff called me back. He told me they found footprints around the cabin matching the ones I described, but no signs of anyone living there. They suspected a transient or someone looking for a place to hide out. He advised me not to return to the cabin alone. I haven't gone back since. The whole experience left me shaken in a way I hadn't expected. The forest, the cabin, the silence, it was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it became a place where I felt watched, hunted, vulnerable. Sometimes, I think about what might have happened if I'd stayed longer or if the person had decided to make the cabin their home while I was there. But I know one thing for sure. Not all isolation is peaceful, and sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the people who slip silently into the shadows, waiting. It started with a plan I thought was foolproof. A solo weekend retreat in a remote cabin somewhere deep in the forest. Just me, the quiet, and no distractions. I'd been craving peace after months of constant noise and people, and I figured a few days alone with nature would do me good. I picked a spot I found online. A small cabin tucked away in the mountains, rented out by a guy who assured me it was private, off the grid, and perfect for anyone who wanted to escape. I packed my bag carefully. Food for 3 days, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, some matches, a small camping stove, water bottles, and enough warm clothes to survive the cold nights. I also brought a pocket knife and a small hunting knife, nothing crazy, just in case. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I expected no signal out there. I left town early Friday morning and drove for hours, following the directions printed out on a faded piece of paper. The roads got smaller and bumpier the farther I went, turning from paved to gravel and then dirt. Eventually, the GPS stopped working, so I relied on the map and my instincts. Trees thickened around the road, and the air grew cooler and fresher. I parked at a small clearing and walked the last half-mile to the cabin, dragging my bag behind me. The cabin was smaller than I expected but sturdy-looking, made of rough logs and dark wood. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded by tall pine trees. The windows were covered with grime, and the porch creaked under my weight. There was a rusty metal mailbox near the path, but it was empty. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had left for me and stepped inside. The inside smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a simple kitchen counter with a sink, a few cabinets, and a fold-out table. A single bed sat against the far wall, covered with a threadbare blanket. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no heat aside from the stove. I wasn't surprised. It was all part of the deal. I liked the simplicity. After I set down my bag, I unpacked some food and water, then got the stove going. The dry wood stacked next to it caught fire quickly, sending warmth and a faint smell of smoke into the room. I sat down to eat, listening to the quiet crackling and the distant sounds of the forest. Birds chirped occasionally, and I heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The first night passed without incident. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold air seep through the gaps in the wooden walls. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to creak and branches to tap against the cabin. I felt comforted by the isolation, by the sheer silence that wrapped around me like a blanket. The next day, I decided to explore. The cabin came with no internet, no TV, no distractions, so I wanted to get a sense of the area. I packed a small day bag with water, some snacks, my knife, and a flashlight just in case. The forest was thick and green, full of tall pine and fir trees, with patches of moss covering the ground like a soft carpet. The air smelled clean and sharp. I followed a narrow trail that I thought might lead to a nearby lake the owner had mentioned in his notes. The path was uneven and littered with rocks and fallen branches, making every step a bit of a challenge. I kept my eyes on the ground and the trail markers, old strips of cloth tied to branches, faded and dirty. After an hour or so, I stumbled into a small clearing where the sunlight poured in and warmed the earth. The place was beautiful, peaceful, and I sat down on a fallen log to rest. I noticed some footprints near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, maybe a day old. They looked like boot prints, heavy and wide. It struck me as odd. The owner had said the area was rarely visited, and I hadn't seen a single person since I got here. Still, I shrugged it off, maybe hunters or hikers. I was far from a town. People sometimes came this way. I kept walking, but after a while, I decided to turn back. The sky was starting to gray, and the forest felt colder than before. I made it back to the cabin just as dusk settled. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and earth. I started the stove again and prepared a simple meal. Outside, the wind howled a little stronger now, rattling the windows and sending shadows flickering across the walls. As night deepened, I began to hear noises that made my stomach tighten. Not animals, or at least not the usual kind. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, crunching on dry leaves and twigs. Sometimes they'd circle the cabin, other times they'd stop for a while, just outside the window. I didn't see anything through the grimy glass, but the sounds were clear enough. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, and the feeling of being watched settled over me like a thick fog. I tried to calm myself by reminding that it was probably just wildlife, maybe a deer or a bear pacing nearby, but something felt different. The footsteps weren't random. They had a rhythm, a pattern. They'd stop suddenly, then start again, like someone was pacing back and forth. Sleep didn't come easily. I sat by the stove with the flashlight in hand, scanning the dark woods through the window. At one point, I saw a shadow flick past just outside, moving quickly behind a tree. My heart pounded. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but I knew what I saw looked upright. A person. The next morning, I found more signs. Outside the cabin door, there were several sets of footprints in the mud, fresh and human. They weren't here the day before. Someone had been near the cabin while I slept. Panic started to build in me. I checked my phone again, still no signal. No way to call for help. The nearest town was hours away by foot. I packed some essentials, ready to leave if I had to, but the road back was long and dangerous, especially if whoever was out there decided to follow me. I spent the day watching the woods, every sound setting my nerves on edge. I wasn't imagining things. Someone was nearby, and they weren't just a casual hiker. The footsteps came again at night, louder this time, accompanied by the faint sound of something dragging along the ground. That night, I kept the cabin lit by the stove fire, knife close, and flashlight ready. Around midnight, the noises grew worse. Heavy breathing outside, the sound of branches snapping under heavy boots. Then, something knocked on the door. A hard, deliberate knock that echoed in the silence. I froze, listening to my own breathing. The knocking came again, louder and more insistent. I didn't move. I grabbed my knife and slowly moved to the window, trying to see who was outside. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, barely visible in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound except the heavy breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what this person wanted, but the whole situation felt dangerous. I kept the door locked and stayed away from it. The figure eventually disappeared into the woods, but the fear didn't leave me. The next morning, I debated what to do. I thought about hiking out, but the trail was rough and I was tired. I decided to wait until daylight and see if anyone else came by. I left the cabin door locked and peered out cautiously. Around midday, I saw a man walking down the trail toward the cabin. He looked rough, dressed in worn clothes and carrying a backpack. Relief washed over me. Maybe he was a hiker or another cabin renter. I stepped outside cautiously. He approached slowly, not saying anything. He looked at me with tired eyes and then pointed toward the woods, like he was warning me about something. I nodded, but he said nothing more and continued down the trail. After he left, I noticed a broken tree branch near the edge of the clearing. It looked like someone had tried to hide something under it. I knelt down and found a small pack wrapped in plastic. Inside were some canned food, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a crumpled note that read, "They watch, not safe. Leave." My heart dropped. I didn't know who they were, but the warning was clear. I felt trapped, unable to call for help, not safe in the cabin, and unsure about what was lurking nearby. I spent the rest of the day packing everything I could carry. I made sure the stove was out, locked the door, and started walking down the trail before sunset. Every sound in the woods made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant calls of birds that suddenly went silent. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where I had parked the car. When I got there, I felt exhausted, my legs shaking. I locked the car doors and sat inside for a few minutes, catching my breath. I was safe for now. Driving back down the bumpy road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror. The forest looked endless, dark, and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been watched the entire time. I never found out who was out there or what exactly they wanted. Maybe they were hunters, maybe someone dangerous living off the grid, or a group of people I didn't want to cross. But one thing was clear, the cabin wasn't as I didn't plan to stay long at that cabin. Just a quick weekend away from the noise of the city, away from the constant buzz of emails and the weight of everyday worries. The idea was simple. Get into nature, breathe some fresh air, clear my head. The cabin was somewhere I found online. Old, cheap, tucked away in a thick patch of forest about 4 hours north. It wasn't fancy, no electricity or running water, but that's what I wanted.
No distractions.
No internet, no interruptions, just me, the woods, and silence. When I first arrived, the sun was already low, pouring orange light between the tall pines. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt track, bumpy and narrow, barely wide enough for a single car. I remember thinking that no one came here very often, which made me feel better about the solitude. I parked by the small wooden porch, grabbed my pack, and walked up the steps. The cabin looked like something out of an old postcard. Simple rectangular frame, weathered with stained dark by years of rain and sun. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it didn't look unsafe. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Musty wood, damp earth, and something faintly like mold. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the beams of fading sunlight. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table covered in scratches and stains, and a rickety chair shoved under it. A narrow staircase led up to a loft. The whole place was roughly 15 by 20 feet, maybe less, but cozy enough. I felt a sudden rush of calm. This was going to be good. I unpacked my gear, stacked some dry wood next to the stove, and filled the small basin with water I had brought in bottles. I didn't want to risk drinking from the nearby stream just yet. As I got the stove going, sparks and smoke filled the tiny chimney. The sound of crackling wood was comforting. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine branches, making a constant whispering noise. That night, after eating some canned soup and reading a book by the dim light of a battery lantern, I went to bed early. The loft was cramped but warm enough with the stove running below. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I was used to solitude. The woods, after all, had their own language. The soft hoot of an owl, the distant snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Nothing to be afraid of. I didn't expect the noises to change so suddenly. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sharp sound outside. Not like the usual forest noises, but something heavier. Something deliberate. It was the sound of something or someone walking just beyond the cabin, the crunch of boots or heavy footsteps pressing down on dry pine needles. At first, I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, though they usually wouldn't make such firm steps. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to listen. The steps moved slowly, circling the cabin, sometimes close enough that I could hear the brush of leaves against the wooden walls. The wind had dropped, and the forest was unnervingly silent apart from those footsteps.
No birds.
No wind, just those heavy steps moving around the cabin's perimeter. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and shone it out the small loft window. The beam cut through the dark, but the trees swallowed everything. Nothing moved, no eyes reflecting back. The darkness felt dense, like a wall pressing against the glass. I told myself it was probably someone passing by on the old forest road, maybe a hunter or another camper. But I wasn't near any marked trails, and there was no sign of other cars or people when I arrived. Still, I tried to stay calm. After what felt like an hour, the footsteps stopped. I strained to listen, but only the soft hum of the night remained. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under the thin blanket, but my mind stayed sharp, unwilling to drift fully to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin carefully.
No footprints.
The earth was dry, and the ground near the cabin had no fresh marks or tire tracks. The dirt path was unchanged. No sign of anyone walking around the cabin except me. That afternoon, as I explored the forest nearby, I found something strange about the trees. Near the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat, several pine trees had deep scratches gouged into their bark. Long vertical scars, like someone had scraped them hard with a sharp tool or a metal object. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. I looked up and down the tree line but didn't see any obvious explanation. I took pictures with my phone just in case. It felt weird, like some kind of warning. That night, I was more cautious. I locked the door the best I could, pushed a heavy chair under the handle, and set the stove fire so I could see through the windows if needed. I sat on the floor near the door with my backpack ready, a small hatchet by my side, and my phone charged in case I needed to call for help. The cell signal was weak but not completely gone. I hoped it would be enough. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, not just walking but slow pacing, circling the cabin like a predator. The sound was heavier this time, dragging slightly on one foot. I didn't move, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped suddenly near the porch, and then something scraped sharply against the wood outside. A long, slow scraping that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like metal against wood, grinding hard enough to make me wince. I wanted to look through the window but was terrified to see whoever was out there. The scraping stopped abruptly, and the footsteps retreated slowly into the dark forest. I sat frozen until dawn, waiting for any other sign of movement. The next morning, the door was different. Where I had pushed the chair under the handle, there was a deep gouge in the wood, like someone had tried to pry it open with a crowbar or a strong knife. The wood splintered badly around the lock. Whoever had been out there had tried to get inside. Panic hit me. I checked my phone. Only one bar of signal. I started to pack immediately. I wanted to leave, but the thought of hiking out in the deep forest alone made me hesitate. The forest was dense and wild, and the road was miles away. Still, staying meant risking whatever had been watching me. As I grabbed my pack, I heard another noise, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine. Low, rough, coming from the dirt track outside. I ran to the window, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. A dusty old pickup truck appeared through the trees, slow and cautious. The engine sputtered and then stopped near the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see the driver, but the truck's headlights shone dimly. I froze, unsure whether to run or hide. The truck stayed still for several minutes before the engine started again and it drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. That day, I hiked out cautiously, keeping my pack light and my eyes scanning constantly. The feeling of being watched was intense. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the main road and cell signal, I called the local police and reported the incidents. They told me the area had been the scene of some illegal activity. Drug runners and poachers had been using old cabins as base camps. No one lived here permanently, but there were occasional visits from suspicious people who wanted to stay hidden. The scratches on the trees and the marks on the door were likely signs of trespassers testing or threatening whoever was inside. I felt lucky to have left when I did. That night, safe in a motel room with a lock on the door and a phone in my hand, I thought about the cabin, the peaceful start, the quiet woods, and how quickly that calm shattered. It wasn't the dark or the forest I feared, but the people lurking within it.
No ghosts, no myths.
Just real danger hidden in the shadows. I never went back.